This is the Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. Join our conversation on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. We're here to talk about the week's news with Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show here on WNPR. Howdy, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Also here with us is Dan Haar. He's associate editor and columnist at Hearst, Connecticut Media. Hello there, Dan.
Good morning, Mr. John Dankosky.
And Christine Stewart is here. She's editor of CTNewsJunkie.com. Christine, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Well, we were just talking about before we got in. You churn your own butter?
I do.
That is so
Really?
weird.
That's excellent.
Is it weird?
I
What
don't
do
know
you
that
live
it's
in
weird.
Sturbridge Village or something?
I feel like it tastes so much better. I don't know. And then you can actually regulate the amount of salt that you have on your butter.
I may have to adjust my feats of strength for the end of the program here. Christine Stewart, not only the hardest working woman in Connecticut media, but she also churns her own butter. Well, there's a lot to talk about this week, and let's start with the biggest news, not out of Hartford, but out of Washington. It seems as though Nancy Pelosi, who is slow to warm up to the idea of impeaching Donald Trump, now has potentially a reason to. His phone call with Ukraine's leader has drawn a whistleblower complaint, and it's drawn seemingly a new investigation by House lawmakers and also those in the Senate. Let's hear first from two Connecticut lawmakers, Chris Murphy and Jim Himes, who've both gotten on board the impeachment train.
In every single conversation an American president has with another world leader asking them to do something, especially with a country like Ukraine that is so dependent on U.S. support. So even if he didn't say explicitly, if you don't investigate the Bidens on this BS charge I'm making, you're not going to get the aid, of course Zelensky would consider that if he didn't accede to the president's direct personal request to him, that there would be consequences. And I think as far as we know, Zelensky did not instigate an investigation of the Bidens, and guess what happened? The aid got cut off.
Has the president's behavior crossed an impeachable threshold? Of course it has. That box has been more than ticked long ago. Does a sense of, does Congress stand up to a rogue president demand impeachment? Yes, it does. And those two things caused me to call for an impeachment inquiry.
So it's Jim Himes speaking on Where We Live and Chris Murphy speaking on MSNBC. So a lot to unpack there, Colin. There's the Chris Murphy piece of this, and then there's the House piece of this. The members of the House in Connecticut have gotten on board, some of them more slowly than others. Where do you want to start with this today?
Well, it is hard to know. I mean, as I was saying to you before we went on the air today, if the hearings were held tomorrow, there'd be some discussion of actually probably calling Chris Murphy as a witness. He has had one of the more recent conversations with Zelensky about all this, which would be interesting. I think by the time they get into the hearings, they will have developed enough of a body of evidence so they don't need Chris to testify. I still think that on the Connecticut level, for example, there's a lot of people now, a lot of members of the press who are trying to compile a register of people who are firmly in the impeachment camp and people who are kind of leaning that way but kind of on the fence, and then some people who just don't seem prepared to go there among the Democrats in the House. Some of the ways that the Democrats in Connecticut have worded what they've said, I'm not even sure where I would put a couple of them, although we watched yesterday as Joe Courtney really kind of crossed over firmly into the impeachment camp. There's so much to say and so many things to talk about. I don't exactly know where to begin other than to say this is clearly the bridge too far. There have been many bases, as you heard Jim Himes say just a few seconds ago, for starting impeachment in the past. They somehow or another weren't enough. And I actually think one of the contributing factors this time around is that barring an impeachment motion, barring an impeachment summons, we know now how President Trump and his office treat requests for information, subpoenas, requests that somebody testify. They just don't do it, right? So, I mean, they say no. And that didn't start with Ukraine. That's been a pattern. So I think one thing that may have ultimately pushed Pelosi and some of the others over the edge is, this is the only way to get answers. And I'm still not 100% sure that answers will be obtained, without some kind of pretty protracted fight.
The idea, Danny, of Nancy Pelosi and then members of the Connecticut congressional delegation and other members of the House getting up and saying, okay, this is a bridge too far. It's not like they gladly took that next step. I think Nancy Pelosi sort of has been not exactly looking for ways to get into an impeachment fight over the course of the last couple of months because it might be very bad politically, or at least some think, for Democrats. There's other liberals in the country who are saying they should have done this a long time ago.
Well, they're communicating all the time, and I'm fascinated by how the tsunami happens when it finally does happen. It sort of reminds me of the day after Charlottesville when Trump said there were good, fine people, I believe, on both sides, and the corporate council, sort of one after another, there was one leader, and then one after another they fall, and that's sort of what happened here. It didn't happen organically, nor did it happen as pressure on Pelosi from the rank and file in Congress. It was sort of a push-pull, a little bit of both. Everyone in the building there knows that on January 20th, 2021, Trump is going to wake up as president, unless you can convince Republicans that he's a liability and they go with presumably Pence or somebody else. Seems to me they have time to do that, but there isn't that sort of appetite in the Senate, from what I can tell from talking to our people, Blumenthal and Murphy. So.
Yeah.
And let's be clear, they haven't actually launched an impeachment inquiry yet. So
yet.
that takes a definitive vote. And according to the New York Times latest count of how many are in favor of impeachment and how many are not, they have 205 representatives in favor of impeachment, and I believe you need 218.
That's correct.
Which means that it may fall a little bit short, which means that the Democrats who are going out on a limb or taking that next step may be feeling as though they're taking that next step and can't really then gain anything from taking that step politically.
I think that the speaker's support for this to begin to move forward helps give them some cover.
Well, I think the point is that it's a pure political play. This is not about legal issues.
Right.
This is actually more similar to the emoluments case, Blumenthal's emoluments issue, where you're pressuring foreign leaders, in both cases, to either investigate my opponent or stay in my hotel. And there probably are lots of examples like that. This less, to me, resembles Russia, which is more can I say collusion? I guess I can't now.
You can say collusion.
Okay.
If you think it's collusion. Yeah, I'm not sure what you're saying about it being a pure political play. I mean, this is obviously there have, as we said before, been other instances when they could have impeached. And if we look at what high crimes and misdemeanors seems to mean, relying on people like Alexander Hamilton, that it seems to involve some breach of trust of office. It doesn't map one-to-one onto criminal statutes for crimes or misdemeanors or felonies or anything else. We've been there for a long time. So if it's a political calculation, it's one where they finally feel as though the negatives that attend to not doing it are so big that they have to do it now. I will say this. Everybody always talks about this as something that has large negative consequences potentially for the Democrats who run an impeachment inquiry. The downside for Republicans could be massive. I mean, my father was a Republican. He was a lifelong Goldwater Republican. I will never forget watching him watch the Watergate hearings and just saying over and over, these people are evil. These people are evil. And by the time it was over, he was never a Republican again. If, in fact, there's just massive cynicism on exhibition and Republican senators and Republican representatives don't respond to it, if they don't respond to evil, there will be consequences. I mean, Trump enjoys a tremendous 80-85% approval rating within his own party. I'm not sure that holds together at the end of an impeachment process.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question. And what I mean by political is that it's more of a calculation through the lens of the 2020 election than it is a legal inquiry. And the purpose of the legal inquiry is to bring out things that will help the Democrats in 2020. And again, as you said, and I think we all believe that the wild card are Republicans who break the wall. And if that happens, then the game is over. But it could not happen until the timing of it could be that it's still all about the election and not about the legal process.
A lot of the piece of this, though, Christine, that comes from the left across America is that there is actually a legal issue here, and people point to the job of the House of Representatives to be a check on the executive, to hold this power. And if you're going to keep talking in every press conference that you've had for the last 2 years about how President Trump has done this and President Trump has done that, and he's broken trust with the American people, once he goes a bridge too far, I mean, an awful lot of Democrats are saying, you have to do this, and you actually have to take the legal route. This isn't just about politics for them.
Right. I don't believe that it is. I mean, I think that Nancy Pelosi tried to hold this at bay as long as she could, but the floodgates broke with this, and she understands that as the leader of the House of Representatives that she has to hold the executive branch accountable. It's more of a balance of powers here, and Congress has to act.
I think also one of the things that she made as a prerequisite was that Republicans had to join in. And at a certain point, this became an untenable framework because the Republicans weren't going to join in almost no matter what. I mean, you find yourself asking a question. Imagine, what if he ran over somebody with his car or something intentionally and Republicans wouldn't join in? Would you still have that? So there has to be some area where the unwillingness of Republicans to participate becomes less and less important and not the deal breaker or deal maker that it was. I just want to say one thing, because I'm going to say this as much as I can in the next few months, and I'm going to say it on social media. Please, Democrats in Congress, turn most of the questioning over to trained counsel. I mean, if you go back to Watergate, yes, Sam Ervin became kind of a star. Yes, there were questions asked by the committee. But Sam Dash and people like that, I mean, the relevant testimony elicited from most of the witnesses was done by trained legal counsel. They found that out with Lewandowski the other day, too. They didn't do a good job of asking Corey Lewandowski questions because they never do, because they're not trained. They don't know how to do this. And they're 80% of their concentration is on how they're coming across. Whereas their staff, their legal staff, they were able to get much more substantive answers out of Lewandowski. They should take that as a lesson.
An interesting lesson. The other thing that Colin had brought up earlier, Dan, is that we have to take a look at what this might mean for the Democratic presidential field. Elizabeth Warren has been gaining ground on Joe Biden. This is an inquiry that continually brings up the name of Joe Biden and raises questions about him and his family's involvement in Ukraine. I think it's pretty clear to say these aren't apples and apples, but Joe Biden is still taking a political hit for this.
Warren is looking more like the winner in Iowa, if you believe momentum and not polls in the moment, although obviously we can't know that. And that throws the whole sort of system into disarray because the strength of Biden is that is the strength of Biden. It's not the guy himself, because obviously he's not comporting himself very well on the campaign. He can't answer questions. So you have one set of people that are so far to the left that they're out of touch even with many mainstream Democrats, and you have another person who seems to be sort of doddering. I know that that's a loaded word when you're talking about somebody over 70. What is he, 78, 77?
I don't know.
I think
so. But the problem, he can't answer
80,
questions.
Yeah. So Quinnipiac University came out with a poll this morning in which Elizabeth Warren actually beat Joe Biden, and not within the margin of error of 2%, but still significant that this is the first time that that's happened.
Yeah, and I think that so the survey period on that Q poll went into Monday, so there's sort of no question that this story was part of some of the calculations in answering those questions. I'd say two things about that. I haven't really had time to go through the crosstabs of that poll, although one thing that I noticed was that people who support Biden are less likely to change their mind than people, they say that anyway, than people who say they support Elizabeth Warren. So his support is harder, hers is a little bit softer. But I think the Democrats are going to have to make another calculation here, which is it may be necessary to – I mean, if there's any there in Ukraine, and there hasn't been a shred of proof produced so far that the Hunter Biden stuff, the Joe Biden stuff is meaningful. But if there's any there, they may, wind up having to throw one of their own a little bit to the wolves in order to get to the meat of this impeachment motion.
In today's day and age, there doesn't really have to be a there anymore. I mean, there could just be the appearance of, and you're done.
Yeah, Biden is pretty good at Teflon. He's not as good as Trump and Reagan,
right,
but he got by the busing gaffe, and it was a gaffe, pretty well.
I do find it interesting, though, Christine, that we live in a day and age where there doesn't have to be any there for something bad to happen, you to lose your job for the rest of your life and never to be hired again. Sometimes, though, you can do just about anything, as Colin suggested before. If you're the president of the United States, and it doesn't matter how much there is there, it doesn't hit you. And that's, I think, what makes everyone feel so uneasy going into this 2020 election. This is the first time I've ever felt like there's an election coming up in which no matter what happens, there's a whole lot of people that aren't going to think it actually happened. And that actually kind of scares the hell out of me. I don't know about you, but it's something that's a little bit scary to look at 1 year out.
Well, I think, we do this job to some extent to speak truth to power and to hold people accountable for what is actually truthful. And when that doesn't matter, that's frustrating.
One thing that I got to say is that we kind of can almost suspect who the John Dean of this story is going to be. It's going to be the whistleblower. At some point or another, we are going to meet the whistleblower. And the whistleblower's report was enough to be certified as credible by the Inspector General or whatever his title, Atkinson, and is urgent, to be flagged as urgent. We don't know who that whistleblower is.
I've gotten the impression that the whistleblower is more of a staff-level person and not a high-level policy person.
But there's the whole theory that it's Dan Coates. I would agree. I don't think it's Dan Coates. But whoever it is, Atkinson flagged it. He said it was. It's like there's a whole meme on the internet now. It's somebody overheard two guys talking in a bar, and that's where all this came from. Well, no, this report would not have been flagged as urgent and identified as credible based on that. There's clearly multiple instances of whatever this is, and the sooner we find out what it is, the better.
Speaking of stuff that I think we know is actually true, but that doesn't necessarily mean people take any sort of action on it. Climate and climate change, Dan, has been a huge issue this week. Very powerful speech by a young woman in front, speaking truth to power. Talk about that, about how we as a society and they as the United Nations, leaders around the world, are basically failing her generation and they need to act. This is an interesting time, an interesting place where all these things are happening. All the world leaders gathered in New York, and we're listening to young people saying, we're not going to take this anymore. It's really been fascinating with everything else swirling around Washington.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible not to have an emotional reaction to this kid who's just angrily railing into us. And the question is, what precisely is she saying and what precisely does she want? And it seems to be a lot about policy and technology, and very little is being said throughout this movement. In all of what I've read, I have yet to read anything about any objector to the lack of personal sacrifice. There is political action that has to happen. There is technology that has to be brought along, and the political action and the technology play into each other. And there is personal sacrifice. People need to do more than think that I'm drinking a bottle of iced tea and I'm recycling it, so I'm fine. And they need to do more than stop using straws. I get that that's a slightly different issue, but there's the idea that the average person has about what they need to do in respect to Earth sustainability is laughable, and it's a joke. And I kind of wish that these kids, both at the global stage and at the local stage, locally here, would start pushing for that and saying, you people have to change, and we will too, and we do too. People need to stop. Like, I mean, I'm good.
But isn't that what policy? I mean, policy is there in large part to help change that behavior, right? If something becomes illegal, something becomes more expensive, something becomes highly taxed, all of a sudden you don't do it as much. Look at what just happened with California and the president. The president saying we don't want those California auto emission standards, basically setting the rule book for the entire country. California is fighting back against that. Sometimes rules actually help to make that change.
And that's what the great 15-year-old Connecticut organizer, Senna Wazer, said when I spoke with her about it after the rally, that we're doing this to force government to force people to make a change. It's not enough. The language, the discussion has to be about you as a person need to do stuff until it hurts. It doesn't mean use 2 fewer plastic forks a week. It means stop doing what you're doing.
What do you see out of all this week, Christine? Because there really is this amazing groundswell. We saw the marches over the course of the last week or so. All these young people speaking up and, as Dan said, angrily getting in people's faces saying, you need to change something.
At the same time, there's this feeling of helplessness because you thought you were doing something. So you thought you were doing the right thing by throwing the plastic bottle into the recycling. We all thought we were doing the right thing by single stream recycling and throwing everything into that big blue bin. And the issue is that we're not, and nobody has kind of stepped up and begun to even educate us as to what we can do. I think there's a lot of people out there who have no idea.
Really?
I absolutely do. I
really
don't believe that
people...
there's been any sort of educational effort whatsoever to get us to change some of these habits.
And that's why these kids and all of us need to bring that part into the conversation.
Right.
Colin?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think we do know some things. Drive less right away. And I mean, honestly, one of the things that we've and as somebody who loves to travel, this is a hard thing to reckon with. But I mean, air travel is like a huge problem. People are starting to purchase carbon offsets for their recreational trips and stuff like that. We do know a lot of this. And I mean, yes, at a personal level, I happen to be involved with a family of people who, for some reason or other, love to idle their cars. Like they'll pull up. They will pull up. They will go into the house. They will have conversations. The car's still out there. I have actually gone out and turned off cars that were not my own car, and it is a problem. And like John, you're up in Vermont probably more than most of us. Yeah. There are like signs in front of stores saying, "Don't you dare leave your car idling outside our."
They take it really seriously.
They take it really seriously. And I don't know how big a difference that ultimately makes. I mean, I think collectively it makes a difference. I'm always walking by some town landscaping truck. This huge truck that's sitting there with no driver in it, and it's idling. And I'm thinking, what is that thing doing? But I think also it doesn't. I mean, we could change all those habits, but if we don't change it at the level of policy too, we're going to get nowhere. And the policy part of this is important. We have to do it at the municipal level, the state level, and ultimately the federal level. But we can't do that with the current administration. I do want to point out, speaking of Greta Thunberg, the young woman that Danny was talking about at the beginning, Trump's reaction was to make fun of her. And he said she looks like a very happy young girl looking forward to a bright and wonderful future. So she changed her Twitter identification, the little identification line that runs under her picture, to a very happy young girl looking forward to a bright and wonderful future. I mean, she's kind of beating him at his own game there.
Yeah, by the way, that little meme of you're not happy is a long time tried and true retort of the anti-intellectual movement in this country. Is to respond to serious discussion by saying, what's wrong with you? You're not happy, are you? That's an old thing that goes way back. And he knows that.
Yeah, well, yeah, he does. We're talking with Dan Haar. He's associate editor and columnist at Hearst, Connecticut Media. Christine Stewart, who's editor of CTNewsJunkie.com. Colin McEnroe, host of WNPR's Colin McEnroe Show. When we come back, we're going to go a little bit more local. What's happening in Bridgeport? Yeah, that primary election, maybe not over quite yet. Talk about the next in the Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news with Christine Stewart, editor of CTNewsJunkie.com, Dan Haar from Hearst, Connecticut Media, and Colin McEnroe, the host of The Colin McEnroe Show. Hey, Colin, what's in your show today?
Well, it's going to fit our last conversation a little bit. This started out as a show about trash cans because I'm upset about the fact that in a lot of public places they have adopted a policy of not having trash cans. Like at Fisher Meadows in Avon, they don't have trash cans. And they have signs up saying, we don't have trash cans. It's your responsibility to get your trash out of there, which, some percentage of people do, and then the rest of them leave their trash there. Producer Josh Nalea has turned it into kind of a different story, although we're still going to talk about trash cans. We're going to talk about experiments to protect humankind from itself, that, if we've moved into this Anthropocene era, what are we going to do? How are we going to save ourselves, not the planet, because the planet's still going to be here, from ourselves?
Wow. So that's a very deep exploration of trash cans.
I'm pretending I know what the show is about, but I really don't.
As with most Josh Nalea productions,
exactly.
We're not exactly going to know until 1 o'clock on the Colin McEnroe Show. So we were talking about national politics, global issues up front, but now we're going to talk about what's happening in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'm going to read here from the Hartford Courant. Several Connecticut voters have filed a lawsuit seeking to overturn the recent Democratic primary election for Bridgeport mayor and schedule a new one. The suit filed Tuesday comes a day after a state election enforcement commission opened an investigation into possible absentee ballot irregularities in the September 10th contest. I'm looking across at Danny Haar, who's waving wildly at me because, yes, Hearst Connecticut Media has done quite some work on this, Dan, which I was going to say in a moment, but that's okay. We'll go to you first. There's still much more to say about that. There's an investigation by the state. There is a lawsuit by Democratic voters. What exactly is happening next here in this Bridgeport primary election?
Well, what's happening next is that there's that the new lawsuit that was just filed is going to try and fast track this so fast that a judge says, now, wait a minute, this stinks so high and so deep. Can you stink deep? That it needs that it demands a new election even before the general election. And most legal experts say that's not going to happen. Things just don't work that fast. And of course, the state elections enforcement investigation is going to take years. So that's off the table as far as any action. Most people think that a write-in campaign, which Senator Marilyn Moore, is going to is working on, is too high a hill to climb. Mayor Joe, who won in a write-in, was the sitting mayor. And that's quite a different thing. So really, it's just I think it's a long legal process that won't be done by November 5th.
Well, Max Medina, who is the attorney for Marilyn Moore's campaign, has actually also suggested another route. So he has suggested that the SEC can get the Attorney General's office and the Chief State's Attorney's office to intervene because there has been so much irregularity in this election, and not necessarily overturn the election, because I don't think that you're going to find 270 votes anywhere, but he wants to actually get Marilyn's name onto the ballot.
You know, I saw that in your story, and I didn't. I thought that's what he meant.
That's exactly what
we're going to magically get on the ballot.
We're going to get on the ballot. We're going to get her name on the ballot. There was so much that was, that went wrong that they can actually offer this as it's never been done.
Is there
before.
a legal process at all?
It's never been done before. So he's thinking that they can use this legal process in order to get her name on the ballot somehow. And he thinks it should go above Joe Ganim's because of the discrepancy.
Press your luck, Max.
Of course he does. Well, so there's all these different things, Colin. I mean, there's the question of whether or not Marilyn Moore was jobbed, whether or not she can get on this. But then there's also just the voter fraud piece of this. I mean, I'm not sure which one of these avenues kind of makes the most sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I mean, first of all, the thing we just talked about, I didn't understand it very well, although I would understand a move to, in a preemptive way, get her name on the ballot before the ballots are printed, with the notion that ultimately it could be, if it were resolved in a different way, somehow or other people could be instructed at the polling site or whatever that they can't actually vote for Moore, or that they shouldn't because she's not eligible or whatever. But I don't even know whether the mechanics exist for something like that. It seems, first of all, Hearst did tremendous work about this. I think the big thing that we're going to get out of this probably is not a Marilyn Moore ballot line. We're going to get some serious attention to something that should have received that a long time ago, and that's just the practices associated with collecting the absentee ballots, not just in Bridgeport, but pretty much everywhere. Max Medina has said some pretty colorful things, too, about how he's a Bridgeporter and he's tired of Bridgeport being synonymous with dirty politics. And God knows, Bridgeport has had, given us an awful lot of pretty weird Tuesdays over the course of the last few years. But I don't. Unfortunately, Moore didn't do the easy thing. The easy thing was to secure a ballot line. It's so much easier to do that than it is to secure a ballot line during the primaries. And
you needed 207 signatures there.
207 signatures. I mean, that's the problem. There may be another problem. I mean, if the problem with all of this, all of the lawsuits and everything else, you've got to throw out a lot of votes. There are some elections where if you change the vote, if you say, that wasn't really a vote for Ganim, that was a vote for Moore, you don't have to get rid of as many votes. But now you're talking about 200-300 votes that you've got to throw out on some basis. Yep. And that may be pretty hard to do.
You're never going to be able to throw out votes because when you're talking about coercion, it's enough to prove the coercion. You can't prove that the intent of the voter was necessarily the opposite. I think that's also a big one. I would point out that in and of itself, a 75-25 ratio of absentee ballots, leading to, in this case, a 650, or I believe that was roughly margin in the absentee ballots, is not in and of itself proof of a problem, because the Ganim campaign clearly does and always has had a very big absentee ballot operation. So setting aside any question of mishandling of ballots and coercion, which would be illegal, it is entirely possible that the Ganim campaign can have a huge run-up on absentee ballots legally and properly simply by doing that.
I think that Connecticut really has to look at its voting process. And the problem is that the absentee ballot thing is in the Constitution. So in order to change the Constitution, to change how we are able to vote, is a very, very high bar. And they've been unable to get there thus far.
We're just reading something here from Only in Bridgeport, the Lenny Grimaldi blog that follows Bridgeport very closely. It says, with State Senator Marilyn Moore waging an insurgent write-in candidacy for mayor after losing a close primary to Mayor Joe Ganim, speculation has centered on Moore's campaign handing out stickers or stamps to voters in lieu of electors handwriting the name. Is it allowed? This ruling from the Secretary of the State's office, no, the name must be written on the ballot by the voter. But it sort of points to another one of these crazy things, Christine, like you said. The legal gambit that they're trying, never been tried before. Are we going to have a write-in candidate? Can we use stickers? I mean, we're making up all these rules, and we're making up all these rules in an election in which it's literally like a couple hundred people voted entirely. I mean, a couple of thousand people decided the entire election. It's amazing that we really don't know what the rules are in terms of how to do this.
Right. No, it really is. And I think that people who haven't voted by absentee ballot in the past don't understand that there's an application. You have to apply to receive an absentee ballot. And in applying to receive the absentee ballot, you're holding your right hand up, vouching that you will not be able to get to a polling place on Election Day. And a lot of what happened in Bridgeport from the excellent reporting by Hearst, we found out that some of these absentee ballots just show up at these homes.
One of the ironies in this is that people who oppose election reform to open up the absentee ballot process and make it more, for example, no excuse, you don't need to have an excuse to not be there, and to broaden when you can vote by absentee to universal, will say that, see, this is proof that we shouldn't do that. And people who believe that the election reform is necessary will say this is proof that you need to do that. And in a small way, both sides are right. I tend to be on the reformer side, but both sides have a point.
It seems to me that if you had a very clear set of rules that everyone could use an absentee ballot if they chose to without any sort of an excuse, it would open up the franchise of voting to more people, and everyone would know exactly what the rule was.
Well, but it would create more absentee ballots in the aggregate period, and that leaves more room for the handling part. In other words, in terms of the coercion and the handling of ballots, more absentee ballots creates more surface area to have to police.
Also, to quote Joe Lieberman for the millionth time, sometimes what is appalling is not what is done illegally, but what is done legally. What can be done legally in terms of having an absentee ballot operation, is it's would surprise a lot of people. And there are people around here who have specialized in that on behalf of certain candidates, legally getting some of these absentee ballots, particularly out of facilities where older people live. I just want to say one quick thing about the write-in campaign, all right? Danny's right. This is going to be really, really hard to do and not all that analogous to Jardura and Waterbury. But one thing that they should learn from Jardura and Waterbury, and which I think the Moore campaign is unlikely to learn because they don't seem to be good learners. Like this whole sticker thing is like, come on. Is Mike Jardura's campaign was not about potholes in Waterbury or policing or schools or taxing. His entire campaign was how to write in somebody's name on Election Day. All of his advertising, everything was about that, just teaching people how to do write-in votes. And he had a very singular focus about that, and it was a very smart thing to do. And if Moore's going to do this, she's got to hope that she's already made her point about Ganim and then run a campaign that's about how to do a write-in vote because I don't know how. I mean, people don't know how.
Right. It's at the bottom. Apparently in Bridgeport right now, it's at the bottom of the ballot. So you have to put the circle, and then you have to write the name.
I want to ask you quickly, Colin, about one other thing, though, that you had wanted to address in terms of this, and it's an uncomfortable subject for an awful lot of people. The fact is that national Republicans, Donald Trump leading among them, have been saying for years there's massive voter fraud. Democrats are stealing votes. And by and large, you look across the United States, and that's just not true. It is, however, uncomfortable when in city elections in Bridgeport, it seems as though shenanigans do happen, how do we process this idea that no, massive voter fraud isn't stealing House races away from Republicans, but at the same time, it does come up in cities in places like Connecticut all the time.
Yeah, and it is uncomfortable, and we have to do the F. Scott Fitzgerald thing of holding two contradictory ideas in our head at the same time. So when scholars look at this question, are people voting? Are people who shouldn't vote voting? I mean, the number of documented cases of it are so minuscule. Often the thing that is brought up is you have a better chance of being struck by lightning than to have somebody like vote under your name when you don't know about it or something like that. That it really is an incredibly rare thing. On the other hand, when we look at this very granular level in city elections, I mean, Hearst proved it. There certainly seem to be some absentee ballots that were cast in a way that they should not have been as a result of either coercion or deception, and we can't minimize that either. I don't think that it really proves. I mean, the problem is the Republicans use this as justification for voter suppression when they're subjecting people to these increasingly onerous ID requirements to prove that they have any business voting. They say, well, we're trying to do something about voter fraud. Well, voter fraud isn't an epic scale problem. That doesn't mean. And I don't think we should let them get away with that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look at what's going on in Bridgeport because, I mean, clearly there's some things that were done that should not have been done.
One easy way to get around that sort of back and forth about fraud in respect to absentee ballots is to expand early voting, which is easier to police but less, but also broad into the base. That's part of the reform that failed in 2014, unfortunately.
Well, didn't it fail this year too? Which election reform was strangled in its crib in the legislature this year?
In the legislature, yeah, it was a redo of what failed in 2014. Right. Yeah.
Very quickly, Christine, I want to go through a few of the new laws that are going to take effect on October 1st. This is annual rite of passage, right? New laws go into effect. And it's sort of a confusing list of things. Probably leading the list is the new minimum wage goes up to $11. But what's on the list here? What's interesting?
Oh, gosh. So the minimum wage does go up to $11. And we also have the vaping law. So nobody under the age of 21 can buy any sort of vaping products. So I guess this is an opportune time to be having that law go into effect.
Sometimes these laws aren't timed particularly well, and this one seems to have been timed particularly well.
Yeah, no. So there are a bunch of them that will be going into effect. I don't have the list in front of me right now.
I will say, however, that just across the border in Massachusetts, Charlie Baker just announced a 4-month ban on selling vaping products to anybody in that state. He doesn't want anybody vaping until they figure out the cause of these lung diseases.
Juul announced, I think yesterday, suspension of advertising in the U.S., so there may not be a big issue going forward with advertising anyway.
We are up to nine deaths at this point.
Yeah.
That was related to vaping.
I think they're more linked to THC than tobacco, and so they may be underground. The thought is they may be, not the commercially sold vape products that are killing people. They're really two different issues. One is these extremely, sort of tragic, mysterious deaths, and the other is the marketing of flavored vape to kids.
Also the digital services tax will go into effect. So if you buy your Netflix subscription this month, then you're going to be taxed.
You're going to be taxed on that. Danny, what do you see in some of these new laws? What is the impact, for instance, of the $11 minimum wage? The
$11 minimum wage is obviously part of a step up to 2023 with $15, and you have to see it as part of that whole. There are there are no accurate counts of the number of people earning the minimum wage. The rough estimates based on small size sampling is 115,000 people in Connecticut, which would be about 6% of the workforce, and 320,000 who would be affected, meaning their wages are $15 or less now, so they're likely to get a step up because if you're making 12, the person next to you is making 10, they make 11, you go, wait a minute. So that's my assessment is, and I took a pretty close look at it last week, was it's not going to be nothing like the advocates say, pure good for the economy. It is going to slow growth some, but not the sky will not fall like CBIA and the small Business Federation tells us.
I feel like we've already seen the price increases that will be, that businesses have related to the minimum wage increase. So I feel like at the grocery store, my grocery bill has gone up over the past 3 weeks at least $10.
For the large employers,
$15.
the small employers are going to react more quickly when they have to.
Right.
I have a question. I don't know the answer to this question. That's why I'm asking it. When they raise the minimum wage, does the tip credit eligible wage go up in an indexed way? So just to help people understand this, servers right now get $6.38 an hour. Bartenders get $8.38 an hour. So when they raise the minimum wage to $11, you're both shaking your heads.
No, that was the bargain in the House.
That was the bargain, yeah.
That was the bargain. They wanted the tipped wage to increase, but it didn't.
All right. Because I think we're going to talk about that in a second anyway. So.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you what. When we come back from our break, we'll actually talk about this other issue having to do with a veto that Governor Lamont issued around restaurant workers, how he's still sort of working out a deal with lawmakers on that. We're talking with Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show, with Dan Haar from Hearst, Connecticut Media. From CTNewsJunkie.com, Christine Stewart. We're here in the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. Still some news of the week to talk about. I will say we just had a conversation about vaping, what's happening in Massachusetts, what's happening at the state level with the age requirements changing. Big conversation about vaping and some of the health risks tomorrow on Where We Live. Hope you can listen through to that. So, Colin, I want to circle back to this other thing, an issue that Governor Lamont is working on with lawmakers, trying to figure out how to get past a veto from July having to do with the restaurant industry and making it harder for waitresses and servers to sue restaurant owners for wages that they should have been paid under current labor laws. This has been sort of an ongoing issue. It's tied into an awful lot of things having to do with food and food service here in the state.
Right. That seems to be, instead of tolls, we want to start talking about like food and waiting and stuff like that. So I have to laugh a little bit because you were away and I was hosting one day and I was trying to roll out this story or set it up for discussion. And I kept screwing it up and the panel kept yelling at me. I had like this mental block about it. But I think I understand it a little bit better now. Just very, very quickly. So if you are a server, your job is understood to be bringing orders to the patrons, cleaning out their immediate service area, filling condiment containers, vacuuming the immediate service area, and replacing the table settings in the service area. If you are asked, and so that's sort of the stuff that you do at a lower than minimum wage with the expectation that your tips will reflect the service that you have rendered. If you are asked to do other stuff, like get there an hour or two ahead of time to set up the whole restaurant, or go clean the bathrooms out or something like that, theoretically, you should get paid the minimum wage for that because there's no way that you can earn tips while you're doing that. That's sort of the thinking. Now, the problem was not all restaurants do that. They have interpreted a particular set of guidelines from labor that Danny wants to talk about in just a second in a certain way. And the real nut of all this involves one law firm in Hartford, Haber, McKenna, and Dinsmore, 5 lawyers who figured this out. They won a 2015 decision against a restaurant in Windsor where in fact a server was being made to do a whole bunch of stuff that was not tip eligible, but not being paid a minimum wage, being paid the much lower wage, $8.38. And they won a big decision. I mean, it wasn't a big decision. It was $50,000 and change. But, the restaurant industry started thinking, what if everybody who's screwing this thing up got sued this way and there were $50,000 decisions against us? We'd all go under. So they wanted the legislature to protect them from that kind of lawsuit. And in the dead of night, on the last night of the session, when so many wonderful things happened, this was unanimously passed as an amendment to another kind of bill. And so that's where we are, except that Lamont vetoed unanimously passed bills because I think he correctly identified that the level of protection being extended to the restaurant industry really deprived a lot of servers of a chance to get some kind of justice. Did I do it okay this time?
That was perfect.
Yeah, good.
It was good.
Did you?
I think, yes, in the short time we have, yes. The one tiny little layered piece that makes a difference is that Connecticut law is different from federal law in that respect. And Connecticut law requires that restaurants keep track within half-hour increments. And that's the allegation that wasn't done. And the restaurants are saying both that, yes, we did do it right and that that's unreasonable.
And the other quick thing, Christine, that's going into effect, taxes on prepared food items, something we've talked about on the show already. This has been in dispute, too, because there's this idea that we want to bring the cost of a prepared meal at the grocery store in line with what it costs to get it at a restaurant. So where do we stand? I mean, I don't know. Are we going to have taxes on rotisserie chickens?
Rotisserie chickens are not taxed now, and so I don't think the interpretation would be to tax them starting on October 1st. So anything that was taxed, though, so in 2002, DRS had this guidance that said these prepared meals can be taxed at the sales rate. If you have a space to sit down in your grocery store to eat these foods immediately, they can be taxed. So we have been paying tax on a certain small subset of food. The DRS guidance that had come out earlier this month had actually expanded that. And so what they did at DRS was claw back their expansion of what the tax would apply to. And they've whittled it back down to the 2002 level.
Something you just said just sparked something in me. I hadn't understood why my local Stop and Shop had just taken out the little area where you could sit and eat food. They actually just walled it in and turned it into something else.
Oh, interesting. That is probably why. That is also another reason why if you can sit down and immediately consume something, then they're saying you're the equivalent of a restaurant, and so it allows other things to be taxed.
If you work for the Ahold company and you know something about this and you'd like to tell me that's not why you just walled in that, please send me an email today. That's very interesting.
In fairness to Lamont, he's trying to be more rational about what equal things are taxed, and you see this with technology, with computer stuff, and you see it in all kinds of areas where he's saying, let's just make it even and equal. And that's really what he's trying to do here, because a lot of people go into grocery stores instead of restaurants for takeout.
Ned is sort of like a baseball team that goes, 3-162, and now he's having a great postseason. His postseason is like so much better than his season. Like most of the things that he has done lately, I think, has made a lot of sense, and he's been able to exercise his authority in a pretty effective way.
We have time for some feats of strength, maybe some grievances this week. Christine, I'll start with you. Go ahead.
I'm going to give a feat of strength to Hearst, Connecticut media for knocking on more than 100 doors, accessing at least 5 databases, and combing through a spreadsheet of about 2,400 names with 2 questions about how Bridgeport voters voted.
It is a heck of a piece of work, as we talked about on election night. Paul Bass's New Haven Independent, sending people all over the city, actually counting how many votes are going there. Hearst knocking on the doors and actually this is hard work.
It is hard work, so kudos to them.
Big kudos to them. Danny, how about you?
At the risk of looking like I'm pandering at the very mic where I'm sitting, John Dankosky, 25 years behind the microphone at WNPR, leaving Connecticut Public November 1st, taking a buyout, moving onward, upward, and I really, really, really thank you for everything you've done right here in this studio.
I do appreciate it. And when you say moving onward, I'm going to be right here in Connecticut. Just so a lot of people are asking me that because we keep telling stories about people leaving Connecticut for greener pastures. There are no greener pastures. These are the greenest pastures there are. But thank you very much for saying that. I do appreciate it. Colin, how about you?
Obviously, a lot more to come on that score. And also, I should have said 3 and 159. Somebody's going to...
I was thinking that.
Okay. Somebody would have called me on that.
Look, there's a lot of tiebreakers at the bottom of the National League right now.
So very quickly, I just want to sort of add something to what we just talked about, which is, some people know I'm sort of this rabid Packers fan. If the Packers aren't on TV and I can't go over to Bob and Gail Fromm's house to watch them, I often have to go to a sports bar. So my son and I were at Sliders in Plainville on Sunday, and it's like really, really, it's a bar plus just insane amounts of testosterone, people yelling and screaming, and they've got bets down, and it's a very tough environment for waitstaff, and they have to take orders while other people are screaming at the top of their lungs. And I just want to remind everybody that's a hard place to be a server. That waiter is getting paid $8.38 an hour.
Yeah.
$6.38. Sorry, $6.38. $8.38 if you're a bartender. $6.38 if you're a waiter. Tip that person. The people behind me jumped their check. They walked out of the restaurant without paying. And my son wanted to know from the waiter whether she was going to be made to pay for that, and she wasn't sure. But tip those people. These are hard jobs.
Speaking of hard jobs in food service, I just want to give a shout out to someone I got a chance to share the stage with last night at Hartford's Real Art Ways. One of the the awardees in a very special event they did was Manola Sadara. She's chef and owner of the former East West Grill. It's a place filled with memories for me, an old diner turned into a Lao Thai restaurant that has sadly closed. Now, Manola's not only a chef and entrepreneur, but a master teacher of Laotian traditional dance. She gave a beautiful impromptu speech about the importance of the immigrant experience that included a very powerful statement about why we should honor people who want to come to this state and this country instead of constantly talking about why others want to leave or constantly talking about why people who want to come here are doing the wrong thing. She inspired me and many others last night. So a big feat of strength to Manola, a big feat of strength to all of our guests today, to Christine Stewart, to Danny Haar, to Colin McEnroe, of course to Katie Tolarski, who produces our show, and Kion Wolf, our technical producer. We'll be back next week in the Wheelhouse.